The old man's hands trembled as he held the wooden horse. 40 years had passed since he last touched it, 40 years since he carved it in a prison camp an ocean away. The grain of the wood felt familiar beneath his weathered fingers, every curve and detail exactly as he remembered. Across the small apartment in Bavaria, another man watched him, tears streaming down his face. Tommy Dodd had flown 5,000 miles to return this gift, this small carved treasure that had somehow survived decades, moves, and the fading of memory. When their eyes met, no words came. Carl Littman simply clutched the horse to his chest and wept like a child. But this story does not begin with tears of joy. It begins with fear. Texas, summer 1944. The convoy of trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Hearn, their engines coughing dust into the sweltering air. Inside one of those trucks, packed shoulder to shoulder with other captured German soldiers, sat 32-year-old Carl Littman. His uniform was stained and torn, his face gaunt from weeks of transport across the Atlantic. He had been captured near Anzio, Italy, part of a Wehrmacht unit that had simply run out of ammunition, food, and hope. Carl had spent the entire journey west preparing himself for death. Every prisoner knew the stories. Nazi propaganda had filled their heads with images of American brutality, of camps where prisoners were starved, beaten, or worked to death in desert labor gangs. The officers whispered that the Americans showed no mercy, that capture meant torture or execution. Carl believed it. Why wouldn't he? He had seen what war did to men, how it turned them into creatures of rage and revenge. As the truck doors opened and the prisoners climbed down into the blinding Texas sunlight, Carl braced himself for the rifle butts, the shouting, the beginning of his end. Instead, what he heard was a calm voice speaking through a translator. "Welcome to Camp Hearn. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Follow instructions, work hard, and you will be fed and sheltered." Carl blinked in confusion. Around him, other prisoners exchanged glances of disbelief. Where were the dogs? Where were the beatings? The American guards stood at ease, rifles slung over their shoulders, watching the new arrivals with expressions of boredom rather than hatred. The camp itself sprawled across hundreds of acres of central Texas prairie. Rows of white barracks stretched in orderly lines, surrounded by barbed wire fences and watchtowers. But even the fences seemed strangely casual, as if they were more suggestion than barrier. Carl would later learn that the vastness of Texas itself was the real prison. A man could walk for days in any direction and find nothing but empty land, cattle, and heat that could kill. Among the guards processing the new arrivals stood Corporal James Dodd, a 38-year-old farmer from a small town near Waco. Jim Dodd had never wanted to be a soldier. He had a wife, a 7-year-old son, and 200 acres of cotton and cattle that needed tending. But the draft had come, and like thousands of other American men his age, he had put on a uniform and done what his country asked. Too old for combat duty, Jim had been assigned to guard work at Camp Hearn. It was boring, hot, and endless, but it kept him close to home. Most weekends he could still drive back to the farm and help his wife with the harder chores. Jim watched the German prisoners file past, noting their faces. Young men, mostly. Thin, scared, defeated. They reminded him of the farm boys he had grown up with, not the monsters the newsreels depicted. One prisoner in particular caught his attention, a slightly older man with dark hair and careful eyes, who moved with the deliberate caution of someone expecting violence at any moment. That was Carl. In his first days at Camp Hearn, Carl's disbelief only deepened. The barracks had beds, real beds with mattresses and blankets. The latrines were clean with running water. The mess hall served food in quantities he had not seen since before the war began. Potatoes, bread, vegetables, and sometimes even meat. Other prisoners whispered that this was a trick, that the food was poisoned, or that they were being fattened for some darker purpose. But hunger overruled fear, and they ate. Carl was assigned to a work detail maintaining the campgrounds. It was simple labor, raking gravel paths, whitewashing fences, repairing buildings. The American guards supervised, but rarely shouted. They seemed more interested in making sure the work was done than in humiliating anyone. This baffled Carl. Where he came from, power meant domination. Here, it seemed to mean something different, something he did not yet have words for. What Carl did not expect was the child. It was a Saturday afternoon in late August, the air shimmering with heat. Carl was repairing a section of fence near the main gate when he noticed a small figure approaching. A boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with sandy blonde hair and a face full of freckles. The child walked beside one of the guards, holding the man's hand and chattering excitedly. Carl recognized the guard, Corporal Dodd, the quiet one with kind eyes who never raised his voice. The boy spotted Carl and stopped talking. His eyes went wide with curiosity. Carl froze, hammer in hand, uncertain what to do. He had been told prisoners were forbidden from speaking to civilians, especially children, but the boy was staring at him with such open fascination that Carl could not help but offer a small, awkward smile. "Papa, is that a real German soldier?" the boy asked loudly. Jim Dodd glanced at Carl, then back at his son. "That's a German prisoner, Tommy, and don't stare. It's not polite." But Tommy kept staring. "Does he talk different? Does he know about Hitler?" "Tommy, hush now." Carl understood only fragments of the exchange, but the tone was clear. Enough. The boy was curious, not afraid. Carl felt something twist painfully in his chest. Tommy was about the same age as his own son, Klaus, back in Germany. Carl had not seen Klaus in 2 years, not since he was called up for service. His wife's last letter, received months ago in Italy, had said the boy was well, but Carl had no idea if that was still true. The mail had stopped. The bombs had not. For a moment, Carl allowed himself to imagine that this American boy was his own son, safe and healthy and unburdened by war. The thought was so painful he had to look away. From that day forward, Tommy Dodd became a regular presence at the camp. Jim brought him on weekends when there was no one to watch the boy at home. Tommy was fascinated by the prisoners, by their strange language and uniforms, and the fact that they had come from so far away. His father tried to keep him at a distance, but the boy had a talent for wandering. More than once, Jim would turn around to find Tommy standing at the fence, watching the prisoners work or play soccer in the exercise yard. Carl began to notice the boy's routines. Tommy liked to sit near the fence on Saturday afternoons, drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick. Sometimes he brought a toy truck and made engine noises as he pushed it through the dust. Carl found himself drifting toward that section of fence during work breaks, standing just close enough to watch without being obvious. It was pathetic, he knew. A grown man taking comfort from the presence of a child who was not his own. But war had stripped away so much of Carl's humanity that he clung to whatever scraps remained. Watching Tommy play reminded him that somewhere in the world children still existed. That innocence had not been entirely consumed by fire and steel. One afternoon, while sitting in the barracks during a rare moment of free time, Carl pulled out his knife. It was a small folding blade, the kind used for whittling, one of the few personal items the Americans had allowed him to keep. Before the war, Carl had been a carpenter in a small town near Stuttgart. He had learned wood carving from his grandfather, a skill passed down through generations. In the camps, in the long stretches of boredom and waiting, he had taken to carving small figures from scraps of wood. Animals, mostly, a duck, a rabbit, simple things that required no thought. But now, watching Tommy through the window, Carl had a different idea. He would carve a horse. Not just any horse, but a beautiful one, strong and proud, with flowing mane and tail. A toy worthy of a child. A gift that might carry some small piece of goodness across the barbed wire that separated captor from captive. Carl scavenged wood from the camp's supply shed, a piece of smooth pine about the size of his fist. Over the next 3 weeks, during every spare moment, he carved. His hands remembered the movements, the angle of the blade, the patience required to coax shape from raw material. Other prisoners watched him work and shook their heads. Why waste time on a toy for an American child? But Carl did not try to explain. He was not sure he could. The horse took form slowly, 4 legs planted firmly, head raised as if sniffing the wind, tail curved in motion. Carl carved every detail with obsessive care, the muscles of the flanks, the curve of the neck, even the tiny nostrils and ears. He sanded it smooth with scraps of emery paper until the wood felt like silk. On the base, in letters so small they could barely be read, he carved his initials and the year. KL 1945. By early October, The horse was finished. Carl held it up to the light, turning it slowly, checking for flaws. It was the finest thing he had made in years, perhaps in his entire life. Every stroke of the knife had carried his longing, his grief, his desperate need to create something beautiful in a world drowning in ugliness. Now came the hard part, giving it away. The next Saturday, when Jim Dodd arrived with Tommy, Carl was waiting near the fence. His heart hammered in his chest as the boy approached, dragging a stick through the dirt. Carl glanced around to make sure no other guards were watching, then softly called out, "Boy, you, come here, please." Tommy looked up, startled. His father was 20 yards away, talking to another guard. The boy hesitated, then walked slowly toward the fence. "Yes, sir?" Carl's English was terrible, broken and heavily accented, but he forced out the words, "I make, for you." He held up the wooden horse. Tommy's eyes went huge. "For me, really?" Carl nodded and carefully pushed the horse through a gap in the fence. Tommy took it with reverent hands, turning it over and over, marveling at the details. "Papa, Papa, look! The German man gave me a horse!" Jim Dodd's head snapped around. In 3 long strides he was at the fence, his expression hard. "Tommy, step back, now." The boy retreated, clutching the horse. Jim turned his gaze on Carl, and for a moment Carl saw suspicion, perhaps even anger. But then Jim looked down at the carving in his son's hands. He reached out, took it, examined it closely. His expression softened. "You made this?" Jim asked slowly. Carl nodded. "I'm carpenter, before war. I make for the boy. He reminded me of my son." Jim was silent for a long moment, turning the horse over in his calloused hands. He saw the craftsmanship, the care, the initials carved into the base. This was not a weapon or a trick. This was art. This was a father's heartbreak translated into wood. Jim handed the horse back to Tommy. "What do you say, son?" "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." Carl's throat tightened. He managed a nod. "You welcome." Jim studied Carl's face, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not a Nazi, not even really a soldier anymore, just a man far from home, trying to hold on to his humanity by giving a gift to a stranger's child. "Thank you," Jim said quietly. "It's real fine. Work." After that day, something shifted. Jim Dodd began to pause when he passed Carl during work details, offering a nod or a brief word. Tommy begged to visit the camp every weekend, and Jim allowed it, watching as his son played near the fence while Carl worked nearby. They did not speak much, the language barrier too great, but a strange, fragile understanding grew between them. Carl learned that Jim was a farmer, that he missed his land, that he counted the days until the war would end and he could go home. Jim learned that Carl had a wife and son in Germany, that he had not heard from them in months, that he carved to keep his hands busy and his mind from dark places. Once, Tommy asked through the fence, "Mr. Carl, do you miss your little boy?" Carl's eyes went bright with unshed tears. "Every day, every minute." Tommy held up the wooden horse. "I'll keep him safe till you see your boy again, I promise." Carl could not speak. He only nodded and turned away before the child could see him cry. The abundance of the camp continued to astonish Carl. Prisoners were allowed to organize soccer matches, to stage small theatrical performances, even to attend religious services. The library had books in German. The canteen sold cigarettes and candy. It was captivity, yes, but it was captivity that acknowledged prisoners were still human beings. This realization shook something loose in Carl's understanding of the world. Everything he had been taught about America, about democracy, about the weakness of nations that valued individual dignity, all of it crumbled under the weight of daily kindness. One evening, Jim brought Tommy to the fence one last time before winter. The boy had drawn a picture at school, a crayon drawing of a horse running through a field. He folded it carefully and pushed it through the wire. "For you, Mr. Carl. So you don't forget." Carl took the drawing with shaking hands. That night, he pinned it above his bunk, and for the first time since capture, he allowed himself to hope that perhaps, when this war finally ended, there might still be room in the world for mercy. That hope flickered like a candle in the wind through the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945. News filtered into Camp Hearn, slowly, carried by guards who spoke in hushed tones and prisoners who listened to contraband radios hidden in barracks. Germany was collapsing. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years was crumbling after barely 12. Cities were falling. The eastern and western fronts were closing like jaws around the homeland. And then, on a warm May afternoon, the announcement came over the camp loudspeakers in both English and German. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Karl sat on his bunk, staring at nothing. Around him, other prisoners reacted in different ways. Some wept. Others cheered quietly, relieved that the dying had finally stopped. A few sat in stunned silence, unable to process that everything they had fought for, everything they had believed in, had ended in total defeat. Karl felt only emptiness. The war was over. But what had he won? What was he returning to? Within weeks, the machinery of repatriation began to turn. The United States Army started processing prisoners for return to Europe, but the logistics were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of German POWs were scattered across America, and ships capable of transporting them back were in short supply. The process would take months, perhaps more than a year. Priority went to those with families confirmed alive, those with medical needs, those whose labor was no longer required. Karl fell somewhere in the middle of the list. He had received no letters from his wife in over 8 months. The Red Cross had no information about his family's status. His hometown, Stuttgart, had been bombed repeatedly. For all he knew, everyone he loved was dead. But the Americans said he would go home eventually, and so he waited with the patience of a man who had learned that waiting was the only skill that mattered in war. Jim Dodd received his discharge papers in late June of 1945. With the European war over and the Pacific conflict winding down, older guardsmen were being released to return to civilian life. Jim had mixed feelings about leaving. He was desperate to get back to his farm full-time, to see crops that needed him and animals that depended on him. But he had also grown accustomed to the rhythms of Camp Hearn, to the strange community of guards and prisoners that had formed in this isolated corner of Texas. And there was Karl. Jim had watched the German carpenter over the past year, had seen a decent man trapped in circumstances beyond his control. He knew Karl was waiting for news of his family, knew the man's face grew more hollow with each passing day that brought no letters. Jim wanted to say something comforting, but what words existed for such loss? On Jim's last day at the camp, he brought Tommy with him one final time. The boy was 8 now, taller and leaner, but still clutching that wooden horse everywhere he went. The carved toy had become his most treasured possession, something he showed to friends and teachers with pride. "A real German soldier made this for me," he would say, and adults would nod uncertainly, unsure how to respond to such an odd wartime friendship. Jim walked Tommy to the fence where Karl stood waiting. The carpenter had known this day was coming. He wore his cleanest uniform and had shaved carefully that morning, wanting to look presentable for the goodbye. "Mr. Karl," Tommy ran to the fence, pressing his face between the wires. "Papa says you're going home soon." Karl nodded slowly. "Yes, maybe 2 months, maybe 3. Then I go back to Germany. Will you find your little boy? Will you tell him about me?" Something broke in Karl's expression. He knelt down so he was eye level with Tommy, separated by wire and history and an ocean of grief. "I hope I find him. I hope very much. But Tommy, you must know something. In Germany, everything is broken now. Many people are gone. I do not know if my Klaus is alive." Tommy's face crumpled. At 8 years old, death was still an abstraction, but he understood enough to know that Mr. Karl might go home to find no one there. "But you carved the horse for him, didn't you? You made it thinking about him." "Yes," Karl whispered. "I carve it thinking of him and thinking of you. You remind me that somewhere children still laugh, still play, still have fathers who protect them." Jim Dodd stood back, his throat tight, letting the moment unfold. He had learned enough broken German over the past year to understand most of what Karl was saying, and enough about sorrow to know that some pain could not be translated. Karl reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in cloth. He pushed it through the fence to Tommy. "For you. Last gift. Tommy unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a tiny carved bird, no bigger than his thumb, wings spread in flight. It was simple compared to the horse, but perfect in its own way. "So you remember," Carl said. "Remember that even in dark times, something can fly free." Tommy clutched both carvings to his chest. Tears streamed down his face. "I'll keep them forever, Mr. Carl. I promise. Forever and ever." Carl nodded, unable to speak. He looked up at Jim, and the two men shared a long look that needed no words. Jim extended his hand through the fence. Carl took it, and they shook firmly, the grip of men who had found unexpected respect in the strangest of places. "You're a good man, Carl," Jim said quietly. "I hope you find your family. I hope you find peace." "Thank you, Corporal Dodd. Thank you for your kindness, for letting your son see me as a man, not his enemy." Jim nodded. "Take care of yourself." As Jim and Tommy turned to leave, Carl called out one last time. "Tommy, you keep that horse safe, yes? I carved my heart into it. My heart is there, in the wood. You keep it safe." Tommy turned back, his face streaked with tears. "I will, Mr. Carl. I'll keep your heart safe. I promise." That was the last time Carl Littman saw Tommy Dodd. 2 months later, in August of 1945, Carl was loaded onto a truck with dozens of other prisoners and driven to the port of Houston. From there, a Liberty ship carried them across an Atlantic Ocean that was finally, mercifully, free of U-boats and warfare. The crossing took 2 weeks, and Carl spent most of it on deck, staring at the horizon, trying to prepare himself for what he would find. The ship docked at Bremerhaven in early September. The port was a wasteland of twisted metal and sunken vessels. The city beyond was worse. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Survivors moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed, scavenging for food and fuel. This was the fatherland Carl had fought for, had been captured defending. This was victory's opposite. The American and British occupation authorities processed the returning POWs with bureaucratic efficiency. Each man was interrogated, denazified, checked against lists of war criminals. Carl had never been a party member, had never done anything beyond basic infantry service, and was cleared quickly. He was given a set of civilian clothes, a small amount of occupation currency, and papers allowing him to travel. The journey from Bremerhaven to Stuttgart took 5 days. Trains ran sporadically, their schedules dictated by destroyed tracks and fuel shortages. Carl rode in boxcars packed with other refugees and former soldiers, all of them heading toward uncertain homecomings. No one spoke much. What was there to say? When Carl finally reached Stuttgart, he barely recognized it. The city center had been obliterated by Allied bombing. The apartment building where he had lived with his wife and son was gone, replaced by a crater and a mountain of bricks. He stood in the ruins for an hour, unable to move, staring at the place where his life had been. A neighbor, an old woman who had survived in a cellar, recognized him. "Carl? Carl Littman? My God, you're alive." "Greta," he managed. "My wife, Margarete, my son Klaus. Where are they?" The old woman's face told him everything before she spoke. Margaret died in the bombing, 1944, in March. A direct hit on the shelter. "I'm so sorry, Carl." She went quickly. The world tilted. Carl sat down hard on a chunk of concrete. "And Klaus? My son?" He was conscripted, near the end. They were taking boys as young as 14. He was sent east to fight the Russians. I don't know what happened after that. So many didn't come back. 14. They had put his boy, barely into adolescence, into a uniform and sent him to die for a war already lost. Carl bent forward, hands pressed against his face, and made a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a scream. He spent the next 3 months searching. He walked to registration centers, checked lists of casualties, interviewed survivors from Klaus's unit. The Red Cross had incomplete records. The chaos of Germany's collapse had scattered documentation like leaves in a storm. No one could tell him definitively whether his son was dead or alive. Klaus had simply vanished into the vast cemetery that was Eastern Europe. By December of 1945, Carl stopped searching. He could not live in perpetual uncertainty. He had to accept that Klaus was gone, that Margaretti was gone, that everything he had been before the war had been incinerated in fire and madness. He found work as a carpenter in a refugee camp outside Munich, building temporary shelters for the millions displaced by war. The work was hard and the pay minimal, but it kept his hands busy. At night, alone in a tiny room with nothing but a cot and his tools, Carl would sometimes pull out a piece of wood and begin to carve. His hands remembered the motions, the blade knew the grain. But he could never finish anything. Every carving became Tommy's horse in his mind, and he would stop halfway through, throat too tight to continue. Across the ocean, in Texas, the Dodd family returned to their farm and tried to resume the life the war had interrupted. Jim threw himself into the work of planting and harvest with fierce determination, as if hard labor could erase the memory of guard towers and barbed wire. Tommy started 3rd grade and was quieter than he had been before the war. He kept the wooden horse on his bedside table next to the small carved bird, and sometimes his mother would find him holding them, staring out the window. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" she would ask. "Mr. Carl, I wonder if he found his little boy." She never knew quite how to answer that. The years began to pass, each one carrying them further from the strange friendship that had formed at Camp Hearn. 1946 became 1947, then 48, then 50. Jim Dodd rarely spoke about his time as a guard, but occasionally when Tommy asked, he would tell stories about the German prisoners. He never said they were good men or bad men. He said they were just men, caught in history's machinery. Tommy grew into adolescence, then young manhood. He graduated high school in 1956, went to Texas A&M to study agriculture, and returned to help run the family farm. The wooden horse moved with him, always nearby, a talisman of childhood and something deeper he could not quite name. Friends who visited his room would pick it up, admire the craftsmanship, and ask where it came from. "A German prisoner of war made it for me," Tommy would say, back in 44. "No kidding? That's something. You ever hear from him again?" "No, lost track after the war. I don't even know if he survived." In Germany, Carl Littmann rebuilt his life with the slow patience of a man who had nothing left to lose. He remarried in 1952, a widow named Anna, who had also lost everything to the war. They had no children, both understanding without speaking that they had each left their hearts in graves they could never visit. Carl's carpentry business grew modestly successful. He built furniture for the new West Germany, crafting tables and chairs and cabinets with the same meticulous care he had once put into a child's toy. But he never carved another horse. Sometimes Anna would find him sitting in his workshop late at night, a piece of wood in his hands, tears streaming silently down his face. She learned not to ask. Some grief could not be spoken. It could only be endured. The 1960s arrived, bringing prosperity and change. Germany rebuilt with stunning speed, becoming an economic powerhouse. America boomed, sending men to the moon and televisions into every home. The war became history, something taught in schools, something old men talked about over beer. Tommy Dodd married in 1961. He named his first son Carl, born in 1963, though his wife never quite understood why he chose that particular name. "It was my father's idea," Tommy lied, not wanting to explain the complicated truth. Jim Dodd died in 1981 of a heart attack while mending a fence on the farm he had worked his entire life. Tommy cleaned out his father's belongings with the heavy sadness of a man saying goodbye to his last parent. In a box of old photographs and papers, he found a faded picture taken at Camp Hearn, showing Jim in his uniform standing near the fence. In the background, barely visible, a prisoner worked on a carpentry project. Tommy stared at that photograph for a long time, memory flooding back with sudden force. He went to his bedroom and picked up the wooden horse from where it sat on his dresser. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the smoothness of the wood, the precision of the carving. For the first time in years, he looked closely at the base. There, in letters so tiny he had never noticed them as a child, were initials and a year. KL 1945, Carl Littmann. The name came back to him with startling clarity. Mr. Carl, who had given a boy a treasure because it reminded him of his own lost son. Mr. Carl, who had carved his heart into wood and sent it across the wire to a stranger's child. Tommy sat down hard on his bed. 40 years had passed. 40 years since he had stood at that fence and promised to keep the horse safe. 40 years since he had watched a broken man give away the only beauty he could still create. What had happened to Carl Littman? Was he even alive? For the first time since childhood, Tommy began to wonder if he could find out. The thought grew in his mind like a seed taking root. It was probably impossible. Germany was half a world away. 40 years was a lifetime. Carl could be dead or lost or unwilling to remember, but Tommy held the wooden horse in his hands and remembered a promise made by an 8-year-old boy. "I'll keep your heart safe," he had said, "forever and ever." Maybe forever wasn't over yet. Maybe forever wasn't over yet. That thought haunted Tommy Dodd through the winter of 1981 and into the spring of 1982. He was 45 years old, a grown man with a wife, 3 children, and a farm that demanded every waking hour. He had responsibilities, debts, crops that needed planting. Chasing a ghost from his childhood should have been the last thing on his mind, but he couldn't let it go. Tommy began by simply sitting with the memory, letting it unfold in his mind like a map long folded. He remembered the fence, the heat of Texas summers, his father's quiet presence. He remembered a thin man with kind eyes who spoke broken English and worked with wood like it was something precious. He remembered crying when they said goodbye, clutching a carved horse and promising to keep it safe forever. What did forever mean to an 8-year-old boy? Everything. What did it mean to a 45-year-old man? The same thing, Tommy realized. A promise was a promise, regardless of the decades between. His wife Linda found him one evening in his study, the wooden horse sitting on his desk alongside a yellow legal pad covered in notes. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, wearing the patient expression of a woman who had learned to recognize her husband's obsessions. "You've been in here 3 hours, Tommy. Supper's cold." "I'm sorry. I just keep thinking about this." He held up the horse. About the man who made it. Linda had heard the story before, but never with this intensity. "Tommy, that was almost 40 years ago. You were a child. He was a prisoner. The war ended and everyone went home. That's how these things work." "But what if I could find him? What if he's still alive?" "Honey, he'd be in his 70s by now. He might not even remember you." "He'd remember," Tommy said quietly. This wasn't just a toy to him. It was everything he had left of his own son. Linda softened. She walked over and put her hand on her husband's shoulder. "Then what are you going to do about it?" That was the question. What could he do? He had a name, or at least initials. KL. He had a place, Camp Hearn, Texas. He had a year, 1945. And he had a memory of a man who said he was from somewhere near Stuttgart, Germany. It wasn't much. It was barely anything at all. But it was something. Tommy started the way most impossible searches begin, with a letter. He wrote to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., requesting any information they might have about German prisoners of war held at Camp Hearn during 1944 and 1945. He explained that he was trying to locate a specific prisoner, a carpenter whose initials were KL, who had been captured in Italy and repatriated after the war. 6 weeks later, he received a response. The National Archives had extensive records of POW camps, but the lists of individual prisoners were incomplete and not well indexed. They could confirm that Camp Hearn had held approximately 5,000 German prisoners at its peak, but matching initials to full names would require searching through thousands of documents, many of which were stored in boxes that hadn't been opened in decades. If Mr. Dodd wanted to pursue this research, he was welcome to visit the archives in person and conduct his own search. Tommy couldn't afford to fly to Washington. The farm was barely breaking even, and his youngest daughter was starting college in the fall. He would have to find another way. He wrote to the German embassy in Washington, explaining his situation. He received a polite reply in formal English, stating that the embassy did not maintain records of former prisoners of war, and that he should contact the German Red Cross or the Deutsche Dienststelle, the German agency responsible for information about military personnel. They provided addresses. Tommy wrote to both organizations. He explained in simple English that he was searching for a German POW who had been held in Texas, whose initials were KL, who had been a carpenter from the Stuttgart area. Did they have any way to search their records? Could they help him? The German Red Cross replied 3 months later. Their records from the immediate post-war period were incomplete due to the chaos of Germany's collapse. Many files had been destroyed, lost, or scattered across occupation zones. However, they had recently begun a project to digitize and consolidate surviving records. If Mr. Dodd could provide more specific information, such as a full name, date of birth, or military unit, they might be able to assist. Tommy didn't have any of those details. He was stuck. The months crawled by. Summer became fall, fall became winter. Tommy's obsession began to feel foolish even to himself. He was a middle-aged farmer in Texas trying to find a needle in a haystack the size of Europe. The Cold War still divided Germany into East and West. Mail was slow. Language barriers were immense. Bureaucracies on both sides of the Atlantic moved with glacial indifference. But every night, when Tommy walked past the wooden horse on his dresser, he felt the weight of that childhood promise. He had looked a broken man in the eye and sworn to keep his heart safe. That meant something. It had to mean something. In January of 1983, Tommy tried a different approach. He wrote to the local newspaper in Robertson County, Texas, where Camp Hearn had been located. He asked if they would be interested in running a story about the old POW camp and his search for a former prisoner. Maybe someone who had worked at the camp or lived nearby would remember something. The Robertson County Reporter ran a short article in their February edition. Local farmer seeks German POW from Mabathapu camp. The story included the basic details of Tommy's search and a photograph of the carved horse. The reporter noted that Camp Hearn had been one of the largest POW facilities in Texas, housing thousands of Germans who worked on local farms and ranches during the war years. The article generated a handful of responses. An elderly woman wrote to say her late husband had been a guard at Camp Hearn and kept a photo album from those years. Would Tommy like to see it? A retired teacher mentioned that several former prisoners had corresponded with local families after the war, though she didn't know any names. A historian from Texas A&M reached out, offering to share his research on Texas POW camps. Tommy followed every lead. He drove to meet the widow who had the photo album, spending an afternoon looking through faded black and white images of guards and prisoners. None of the faces looked familiar, though he could barely remember what Carl Littman had looked like. He was searching for a feeling more than a face. The historian proved more helpful. Professor Michael Chen had spent years researching German POW labor in Texas, interviewing survivors and combing through military records. He confirmed that approximately 48,000 German prisoners had passed through Texas camps during the war. Camp Hearn alone had processed more than 5,000 men. "You're looking for someone specific?" Professor Chen asked as they sat in his cluttered office. "A carpenter, initials KL, captured in Italy, probably Anzio, sent to Camp Hearn in mid-44 from the Stuttgart area." Chen pulled out a filing cabinet and extracted a folder. "I have some partial rosters from Camp Hearn. They're not complete, and names are often misspelled. But let's take a look." They spent 2 hours going through lists. The names were typed on brittle yellowed paper, organized by barracks number and work assignment. Under the carpentry section for Barracks 12, Tommy saw it. Littman, Carl. Captured, 544, Anzio, age 32, trade, carpenter, hometown, Stuttgart. Tommy's hand shook as he pointed. "That's him. That's gotta be him," Professor Chen smiled. "Well, now you have a full name. That's something." It was more than something. It was everything. Armed with Carl Littman's full name, date of capture, and hometown, Tommy wrote again to the German Red Cross and the Deutsche Dienststelle. This time his letters were specific. He was searching for Carl Littman, born approximately 1912, from Stuttgart, captured at Anzio in May of 1944, held at Camp Hearn, Texas. He waited. Spring came to Texas. Tommy planted cotton and corn, fixed broken equipment, attended his daughter's graduation. Life continued in its normal rhythms, but part of his mind remained thousands of miles away, wondering if an old man in Germany would ever know that someone in Texas still remembered him. In June of 1983, a letter arrived from Germany. The envelope bore the return address of the Deutsche Dienststelle in Berlin. Tommy's hands trembled as he opened it. The letter, written in formal English, confirmed that they had located records for a Karl Littmann matching the description provided. Born March 19, 1912, in Stuttgart. Captured May 7, 1944, at Anzio. Held as POW in the United States, Camp Hearn, Texas. Repatriated September 1945. Last known address as of 1946 was Stuttgart, but their records ended there. However, the letter continued. They had forwarded Mr. Dodd's inquiry to the German War Graves Commission, which maintained a more current database of veterans for the purpose of locating burial sites and notifying families. If Herr Littmann was deceased, they would have that information. If he was alive and still at a known address, they might be willing to forward correspondence. Tommy read the letter 3 times, hardly daring to hope. He had cleared the first hurdle. Karl Littmann had survived repatriation, had made it back to Germany alive, but that had been nearly 40 years ago. So much could have happened since then. He waited again. July passed in brutal heat. August brought no rain and crops that needed constant irrigation. September arrived with the first hint of cooler weather. Tommy had almost convinced himself that the trail had gone cold, that Karl Littmann had died decades ago and there would be no reunion, no closure, no chance to fulfill his childhood promise. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1983, another letter arrived from Germany. This one came from the Kriegsgräberfürsorge, the German War Graves Commission, but the envelope was thinner, less official. Tommy opened it standing in his driveway, unable to wait until he got inside. The letter was brief, just 3 sentences in careful English, but those 3 sentences changed everything. We have located Karl Littmann. He is alive and resides near Munich. He has given permission for us to provide you with his address and has indicated he would welcome correspondence. Below was an address in a town called Graffelfing, just outside Munich. Tommy sat down hard on his front porch steps, the letter clutched in both hands. Alive. Karl Littmann was alive. After 40 years, the man who had carved a wooden horse for a child was still in the world, still breathing, still real. Linda found him there 20 minutes later, staring at the letter with tears streaming down his face. "He's alive," Tommy said. "He's alive, Linda. All this time I thought maybe he was gone, but he's alive." "So what now?" she asked gently. Tommy looked up at his wife. "I have to go see him. I have to return this." He patted his shirt pocket where he always kept the wooden horse now, afraid to let it out of his sight. "I made a promise. Germany is expensive, Tommy. We don't have that kind of money right now. Then I'll save. I'll work extra. I'll sell something. I don't care. I have to do this." Linda studied her husband's face and saw something she hadn't seen in years. Purpose. The kind that couldn't be argued with or reasoned away. "Okay," she said. "We'll figure it out." Tommy wrote to Karl Littmann that same afternoon. He introduced himself, reminded him of Camp Hearn and a 7-year-old boy and a wooden horse. He explained that he still had the horse, that he had kept his promise, that he had never forgotten. He asked if he could visit, if perhaps in the coming year he might be able to travel to Germany. He mailed the letter and waited with the excruciating patience of a man who had already waited 4 decades. 2 weeks later, a reply arrived. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting shaky but precise. Inside was a single page written in English that had clearly been composed with great effort and perhaps the help of a POW dictionary. "Dear Thomas Dodd, I remember you. I remember the boy with bright eyes who stood at the fence. I remember the horse I carved when my heart was breaking. I thought you would forget, that time would erase such small things. But you did not forget. You write to me 40 years later and my hands shake as I read your words. Yes, please come. Please come to Germany. I am an old man now, not long for this world, but before I go I would very much like to see the boy who kept my heart safe all these years. With deep gratitude and emotion, Karl Littmann." Tommy read the letter aloud to his family at dinner that night. His voice broke twice. His oldest son, Karl, asked quietly, "Pop, why did you name me Karl?" Tommy looked at his son, this young man of 20, who carried the name of a German carpenter he had never met. "Because a long time ago, a man gave me something precious when he had nothing left to give. And I wanted to remember that there's good in the world, even in the darkest times, even between enemies. Saving money for the trip took another year. Tommy worked odd jobs during the slow season, repaired equipment for neighbors, sold a tractor he'd been planning to keep. Linda took on extra seamstress work. Their children contributed from their own savings. By the fall of 1984, Tommy had enough for a plane ticket to Munich and a week in a modest hotel. He made the reservations for October, when the farm work would be lightest. He pulled out his old atlas and traced the route from Texas to Germany with his finger, marveling that he would cross an ocean to see a man he had known for less than a year when he was a child. The night before his flight, Tommy sat in his bedroom with the wooden horse in his hands. The carved bird Carl had given him that last day sat beside it. 40 years had passed since these objects had been created by a prisoner's knife. 40 years since a child had promised to keep them safe forever. He turned the horse over and read the tiny inscription one more time. KL, 1945. "I'm coming, Mr. Carl," Tommy whispered. "I kept my promise. I'm bringing your heart back to you." The next morning, Tommy Dodd boarded a plane for Germany, carrying in his luggage 2 small wooden carvings and 4 decades of memory. He had no idea what he would find when he arrived. He only knew that some promises were too important to break, even if fulfilling them took a lifetime. The next morning, Tommy Dodd boarded a plane for Germany, carrying in his luggage 2 small wooden carvings and 4 decades of memory. He had no idea what he would find when he arrived. He only knew that some promises were too important to break, even if fulfilling them took a lifetime. The flight from Dallas to Munich took 14 hours with a layover in New York. Tommy had never flown overseas before, had rarely left Texas except for his college years. He sat by the window and watched America disappear beneath clouds, then watched the Atlantic stretch endlessly below, thinking about another journey across this same ocean 40 years earlier. Carl Littman had made that crossing as a prisoner, packed into the hold of a ship, uncertain whether he would live or die. Now, Tommy crossed it as a free man, in comfort, pursuing a promise made in childhood. He barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the fence at Camp Hearn, a thin man with kind eyes, a small boy clutching a wooden horse. He wondered what Carl looked like now, whether time had been kind or cruel, whether the man would even recognize him. The plane landed in Munich on a gray October morning. The airport was modern and efficient, filled with travelers speaking rapid German that sounded nothing like the broken English Carl had spoken at the camp. Tommy collected his luggage and found a taxi, handing the driver a piece of paper with Carl's address written in careful block letters. The drive to Greffelfing took 30 minutes through streets that seemed impossibly old and foreign to a man raised among Texas plains and cattle ranches. The buildings were stone and stucco, close together, with red tile roofs and window boxes holding the last autumn flowers. The taxi pulled up in front of a modest 3-story apartment building, painted pale yellow, with a small garden in front. Tommy paid the driver with Deutschmarks he'd exchanged at the airport, his hands shaking slightly. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, staring at the building's entrance, the weight of 40 years pressing on his shoulders. What if this was a mistake? What if the reunion opened old wounds rather than healing them? What if Carl had agreed to meet out of politeness but didn't actually want to see him? He pushed those thoughts away and walked to the door. The name Littman was written in faded ink beside apartment 3. Tommy pressed the buzzer. A crackling voice came through the speaker, speaking German. Hello? I'm Thomas Dodd, from America. I'm here to see Carl Littman." A long pause, then the voice again, this time in heavily accented English. Yes. Come up. 3rd floor." The door buzzed. Tommy entered a dim hallway that smelled of old wood and cooking. He climbed narrow stairs, his heart hammering. On the 3rd floor, an apartment door stood open. In the doorway stood an old man, bent slightly with age, wearing gray slacks and a cardigan sweater. His hair was white and thin, his face was deeply lined, but his eyes, pale blue and careful, were the same eyes Tommy remembered from childhood. For a moment, neither man moved. They simply stared at each other across 4 decades of time and history. "Tommy," Carl's voice was barely a whisper. "Mr. Carl." Then Tommy was moving forward, and Carl was reaching out, and they embraced in the doorway like father and son, like survivors of a shipwreck who had found each other against all odds. Carl's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Tommy held him, gently, afraid the old man might break. "I cannot believe," Carl said into Tommy's shoulder, "I cannot believe you are here, that you came all this way, that you remembered." "I never forgot," Tommy said, "not for a single day." Carl pulled back, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. He looked Tommy up and down, shaking his head in wonder. "You are a man now, a big, strong man, not the little boy at the fence. And you're older too," Tommy said with a gentle smile. "But I'd know you anywhere." Carl gestured inside. "Please, come in, forgive me. I'm not a good host. My Anna, my wife, she died 2 years ago. She would have made this nice for you. But I do what I can." The apartment was small, but tidy. A living room with worn furniture, a kitchenette, a hallway leading to what Tommy assumed were bedroom and bathroom. The walls held a few photographs in simple frames. A bookshelf contained mostly German volumes. On a small table near the window sat woodworking tools, half-finished carvings scattered around them. Even in his 70s, Carl still worked with wood. "Please sit," Carl said, gesturing to a sofa. "I make coffee, or tea if you prefer." "Coffee would be wonderful, thank you." While Carl busied himself in the kitchen, Tommy looked around the room more carefully. The photographs on the wall showed various stages of a life. A wedding picture from what looked like the 1950s. A woman with kind eyes standing in a garden, but no children, no family portraits beyond Carl and his late wife. Carl returned with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of cookies. His hands trembled slightly as he set them down. He sat in a chair across from Tommy, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, 2 men separated by an ocean and a language, but connected by something stronger than either. "I have something for you," Tommy said finally. He reached into his bag and carefully withdrew the wooden horse, wrapped in soft cloth. Carl's eyes went wide. His hand moved to his mouth. Tommy unwrapped the horse and held it out. "I kept my promise. I kept it safe all these years." Carl took the horse with both hands, trembling violently now. He held it up to the light, turning it slowly, his fingers tracing the curves and lines he had carved in a prison camp 40 years ago. Tears streamed down his weathered face. "My God," he whispered, "my God, it is still perfect. You took such care of it." "It was my most precious possession," Tommy said. "When I was a kid, I showed it to everyone. When I got older, I kept it safe. When I had children of my own, I told them about the man who made it, about what it meant." Carl looked up, his face crumbling. "Do you know why I made this for you? Do you understand what it was? You said it reminded you of your son, of Klaus." "Yes." Carl's voice broke. "My Klaus, he was 14 years old when they took him, 14. They put him in a uniform and sent him east to fight the Russians. In the final days of the war, when everything was already lost, they sent children to die." He closed his eyes. "He never came back. I searched for years. I wrote letters. I checked lists. He simply vanished. And my wife, my Margaret, she died in the bombing before I ever came home. I lost everything in the war, Tommy. Everything." Tommy felt his own tears coming now. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, Mr. Carl." "When I saw you at that camp," Carl continued, his voice thick with emotion, "when I saw this little boy with bright eyes and a father who loved him, something broke in me. I was dying inside, you understand? Every day I was dying from not knowing if my son was alive, from being so far from home, from losing everything I thought the world was. And then there was you. This innocent child who looked at me not with hate, but with curiosity, with kindness." He held up the horse. "I carved this thinking of Klaus. Every stroke of the knife was a prayer that he was safe, that somewhere he was playing like you played, that he had survived. But I also carved it for you because you reminded me that children still existed in the world, that innocence had not been completely destroyed." Carl broke down completely then, sobbing into his hands, the wooden horse pressed against his chest. Tommy moved to sit beside him on the chair's arm, putting his hand on the old man's shoulder, letting him cry. "He would have been your age now," Carl said when he could speak again. 47 years old, he would have had children of his own, maybe grandchildren, but the war took him. The war took everything. Tommy reached into his bag again and withdrew a photograph. "I want to show you something." He handed it to Carl. It was a family portrait taken the previous year. Tommy stood with his wife, Linda, their 3 children arranged around them. The youngest was a young man of 21 with dark hair and a serious expression. "This is my son," Tommy said, pointing. "His name is Carl Dodd. I named him after you." Carl stared at the photograph, his mouth opening wordlessly. "You named your son for me?" "I did. When he was born in 1963, my wife asked what I wanted to call him. I said Carl, and I told her about you, about the man who gave me this horse and taught me that even enemies could be good people." She understood. Carl held the photograph with shaking hands. "He is beautiful. Your whole family is beautiful." He looked up at Tommy with wonder in his red-rimmed eyes. "You gave my name to your son. You carried my memory for 40 years. Why? Why would you do this for a man who was your enemy?" "Because you were never my enemy," Tommy said firmly. "You were a good man caught in a bad war. You showed kindness when you had every reason to be bitter. You gave beauty when everything around you was ugly. That meant something to me, even as a child. It means even more to me now." Carl set down the photograph and picked up the horse again, cradling it like something sacred. "I carved my heart into this piece of wood. I told you to keep it safe, and you did. For 40 years, you kept my heart safe. And now I'm returning it to you." "No," Carl said, shaking his head. "No, you must keep it. Give it to your son, to your Carl. Tell him the story. Tell him that even in the darkest times people can choose kindness. Tell him that this horse traveled from Germany to Texas to Germany again, and that it carried love across every mile." They sat together for a long time, 2 old men bound by a moment of grace in a graceless time. Carl showed Tommy photographs of his life, the rebuilding of Germany, the carpentry business he had built from nothing, the wife he had loved who helped him survive the grief. Tommy told Carl about the farm, about his father's death, about the search that had led him across an ocean. "Your father, Jim," Carl said. "He was a good man. He treated us with respect when he did not have to. Many guards were cruel, but not him. Never him." "He talked about you sometimes," Tommy said. "Not a lot, but sometimes. He said the war taught him that most people are just trying to survive, that the uniforms don't matter as much as the hearts underneath." Carl nodded slowly. "This is truth. This is what I learned in Texas. I came expecting monsters and found human beings. I came expecting to die and found kindness that saved my soul, if not my life." As the afternoon wore on, they talked about everything and nothing. Carl's hands would periodically return to the wooden horse, stroking it as if reassuring himself it was real. Tommy told him about Texas, about how Camp Hearn was mostly gone now, just a historical marker and some foundations. Carl told him about Munich, about the long rebuilding, about the Germany that had risen from the ashes. "Do you regret it?" Tommy asked quietly. "The war, your service, all of it?" Carl was silent for a long moment. "I regret that I did not see clearly what we were part of. I was a simple man who believed what I was told, who thought duty meant following orders. I did not kill anyone. I was not in the SS or the party, but I was part of the machine that destroyed millions of lives. I carry that guilt every day." He looked at Tommy. "But I do not regret that I was captured. I do not regret Texas. Because in that camp, I learned that there was another way to live, a way built on respect, not fear, on abundance, not scarcity, on treating even your enemies as human beings." "America wasn't perfect," Tommy said. "We had our own injustices, our own failures." "Nothing is perfect," Carl agreed, "but your country treated me better than my own country treated its own people. That is a fact I could not deny. And when I came home and saw what the Reich had done to Germany, I understood that everything I had been taught was a lie." Tommy stayed in Germany for 5 days. He visited Carl each day, sitting in the small apartment, talking for hours, sometimes in an comfortable silence. Carl took him to his workshop in the building's basement, showed him the furniture he still crafted, the small carvings he made for neighbors' children. Tommy bought several pieces to ship home, wanting to carry part of Carl's artistry back to Texas. On the last day, they went together to a small park near Carl's apartment. It was late October, and the leaves were gold and red, falling in gentle spirals. They sat on a bench and watched children play on swings and slides, their laughter carrying across the autumn air. "This is what we were fighting for," Carl said softly. "All of us, on all sides. We thought we were fighting for nations and flags and ideologies, but really, we were fighting for this. For children who could play without fear, for simple days in quiet parks, for the chance to grow old and watch the seasons change." "You helped give that to your country," Tommy said. "Germany rose again because people like you rebuilt it." "Perhaps," Carl smiled, "or perhaps I just made furniture and tried to forget." Tommy pulled out the wooden horse one more time. Carl had insisted he take it back, that it belonged to the Dodd family now. "When I give this to my son, what should I tell him?" Carl thought for a moment. "Tell him that his name came from a man who learned that hatred is a choice, and that kindness is a choice too. Tell him that his grandfather, your father, showed mercy when others showed cruelty, and that small mercy echoed across decades. Tell him that this horse was carved by hands that knew war but chose to create beauty instead of destruction." He paused. "And tell him that somewhere in Germany, an old man thought of him and was grateful that something good came from all that suffering." They embraced at the airport. Carl had insisted on coming to see Tommy off, despite the difficulty of the journey. They stood in the departure terminal, holding each other, crying unashamedly while travelers flowed around them like water around stones. "Thank you," Carl whispered. "Thank you for remembering. Thank you for coming. You have given me something I thought I lost forever. Hope that the world can be better than we make it." "Thank you for the horse," Tommy said. "Thank you for teaching me about grace." Tommy flew home with the wooden horse, wrapped carefully in his carry-on luggage. When he landed in Texas and drove back to his farm, he gathered his family and told them everything. He showed them photographs of Carl, of the apartment, of the workshop. His son Carl held the wooden horse and cried when he learned why he carried his name. 3 years later, in January of 1987, Tommy received a letter from Germany. It was from Carl's neighbor, writing in careful English to inform him that Carl Littman had passed away peacefully in his sleep. He had been 74 years old. The neighbor had found Tommy's address in Carl's belongings, along with a note requesting that Tommy be informed. Enclosed with the letter was a small package. Inside was a wooden bird, wings spread in flight, carved with the same meticulous care as the horse. A note in Carl's shaky handwriting read, "For your son, Carl. So he remembers that even broken things can fly. With love from an old carpenter who never forgot the boy at the fence." Tommy Dodd is 73 years old now, still living on the Texas farm where he was raised. The wooden horse sits on his mantel beside the 2 carved birds. His son Carl has children of his own, and they know the story by heart. They know about Camp Hearn, about a German prisoner and an American boy, about a promise kept across 40 years and an ocean. The horse has been borrowed by local schools for history lessons, displayed in museums, photographed for articles about the unlikely friendships formed in POW camps. But always it returns home, to the family that has kept it safe for nearly 80 years now. Because some things are too precious to lose, some promises are too sacred to break, and some acts of kindness echo across generations, reminding us that even in humanity's darkest hours, light can survive in the smallest gestures: a carved wooden horse, a child's promise, an old man's tears. These were the things that proved stronger than war, more enduring than hatred, more powerful than all the machinery of destruction that humans can devise. Carl Littman carved beauty in a prison camp because he refused to let war destroy his soul. Tommy Dodd kept that beauty safe because he understood, even as a child, that kindness was rare and therefore precious. And in the keeping and the returning, both men found something that war tries to destroy but can never quite kill: hope, connection, the stubborn, persistent, miraculous truth that we are all, in the end, simply human beings trying to find our way home. The wooden horse sits on the mantel still, a bridge across nations and generations. And somewhere, if there is justice in the universe, 2 old friends sit together beyond the fences and the wars, carving beauty from wood and watching children play under endless Texas skies.